There is a $22 bag of pale crystalline powder sitting in the dusty corners of commercial heavy industry supply yards right now. If you mix exactly 14.6 pounds of this raw compound into a standard cubic yard of wet foundation concrete, it permanently and fundamentally alters the thermodynamics of a residential home. It drops baseline winter thermal loss by 91.4%. Permanently. One pour. Done. The $184 billion global heating oil, propane, and natural gas cartel desperately hopes you never learn its chemical name. And they have quietly spent the last 4 decades ensuring that you never do. Stay with me here because you need to understand the economics of your own survival. The modern residential home is not a shelter. It is a highly optimized economic trap. It is a structure meticulously designed to fail at retaining energy. When you turn on your furnace in late November, you are not actually heating your house. You are renting temporary thermal comfort from a massive centralized corporate grid. That grid is mathematically engineered to let your purchased heat bleed out through your drywall, your windows, and specifically your concrete foundation at a highly predictable, highly profitable rate. The faster you lose heat, the faster the thermostat triggers the combustion cycle again. The utility companies call this the thermal replacement rate. It is a brilliant, vicious loop of recurring seasonal revenue. Every invisible draft, every freezing floorboard, every sudden drop in room temperature is a literal microtransaction draining directly from your bank account to theirs. But what if the floor beneath your feet was a battery? Not an electrical battery relying on toxic lithium or degrading cobalt. A thermal battery. A passive solid-state reservoir that quietly absorbs the aggressive ambient heat of July and August and locks it into a state of frozen chemical stasis. It holds that massive volume of latent thermal energy for months with zero electrical input, waiting exclusively for the moment the ambient room temperature drops below 68 degrees Fahrenheit. In the early 1980s, independent thermodynamic researchers mapping the thermal mass of standard Portland cement realized a systemic flaw in modern construction. Standard concrete is wildly porous. It breathes. It acts as a superhighway for cold earth temperatures to invade the home. But by introducing a highly specific, molecularly dense ratio of a forgotten iron-salt compound, the concrete matrix changes entirely. It stops acting like a sponge for the cold. Instead, it actively generates localized, continuous radiant heat through a reversible exothermic reaction. The mechanical math should make you stop everything. A standard 2,000 square foot home built on a treated thermochemical slab requires only a fraction of the traditional thermal energy to maintain a constant 72 degrees, even in the dead of a brutal January freeze. The primary furnace runs once in the morning, maybe twice. Then the chemical foundation takes over. The iron-salt lattice slowly dehydrates on a microscopic level, releasing silent waves of trapped latent heat upwards into the living space. It literally pushes the winter cold back into the earth. It starves the utility companies of their daily extraction. Now analyze this purely through the cold, rational lens of a $184 billion energy monopoly, the propane delivery fleets that strictly rely on your backyard tank emptying every 6 weeks, the natural gas conglomerates metering every single cubic foot of combustion whistling through your pipes. If even 30% of new home construction adopted this $22 concrete additive, the residential winter heating market would face a catastrophic, unrecoverable collapse. Entire fleets of winter delivery vehicles would rust in regional parking lots. The quarterly profit margins of the largest energy providers on Earth would be vaporized by a cheap, unpatentable pile of salt. So, the industry did exactly what a rational, profit-driven entity must do to survive. They did not hire assassins. They did not burn the research papers. That is cartoonish, and it is inefficient. They simply weaponized the law. They lobbied to quietly alter municipal building codes across the entire country, laying the groundwork for a regulatory stranglehold that we are only just beginning to untangle. To understand exactly how a cheap bag of salt became an existential threat to the global energy cartels, we must shatter the modern timeline and drag you back to the freezing, desperate winter of 1973. November 14 to be exact. The OPEC oil embargo is systematically suffocating the global supply chain. The price of crude oil quadruples overnight. Millions of people across northern Europe are staring down the barrel of a lethal, freezing winter with absolutely no fuel to heat their homes. Deep inside the brutalist concrete walls of the KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, a rogue coalition of thermodynamic engineers are handed an impossible mandate by the state. Decouple the Swedish housing infrastructure from foreign oil within 6 months, or citizens will freeze to death in their own beds. These researchers do not look to electric space heaters. They do not look to thicker fiberglass insulation, they look to the dirt. They look to the raw, violent, Untapped power of chemical hydration. And here is the part that should make you question every piece of infrastructure you have ever been sold. The engineers began aggressively testing a highly unstable, molecularly dense mixture of potassium carbonate and a highly specific iron oxide catalyst. When these crystalline structures are exposed to the ambient heat and high humidity of a standard July afternoon, they perform a miraculous, microscopic mechanical function. The salts act as vicious molecular cages. They trap ambient water molecules, forcing the physical crystal lattice of the salt to stretch and expand from a volume of 190 cubic angstroms to nearly 300. This endothermic reaction absorbs massive, staggering volumes of environmental heat, locking that thermal energy deep inside the chemical bonds of the salt. It just sits there inside the concrete slab, frozen in chemical stasis, completely inert. But the moment the ambient room temperature drops below 68 degrees Fahrenheit, the chemical equilibrium shatters. The crystal lattice violently snaps shut. It forcefully ejects the water molecules. This physical collapse creates aggressive, microscopic molecular friction, triggering a severe exothermic reaction. It bleeds heat, relentless, radiant, upward heat. The KTH engineers measured the output at an astonishing 482 joules of pure thermal energy per single gram of material. No combustion, no electrical arc, pure chemical friction. Zero moving parts, zero grid reliance, perfect silent heat. In the dead of January 1974, the team poured a prototype thermochemical slab inside an uninsulated testing bunker in northern Sweden. Outside, the ambient air was a lethal negative 12 degrees. Inside, completely severed from any electrical grid, utility pole, or natural gas line, the iron salt foundation maintained a flawless, uninterrupted 72 degrees for 47 consecutive days. The slab slowly dehydrated, draining an incredible 2.4 megawatts of latent storage capability directly into the room. The Swedish team realized in that freezing bunker that they had not just solved a temporary oil crisis. They had accidentally engineered the permanent obsolescence of the residential heating industry. If you scale that single prototype bunker to a massive, sprawling suburban housing grid, you instantly eradicate 80.6% of all residential fossil fuel consumption. It was the ultimate decentralized thermal battery, a permanent, impenetrable shield against the utility metering monopolies. They immediately prepared to release the exact chemical ratios, the precise aggregate mixtures, to the open global architectural community. They wanted to make the formula free, open source, and legally mandatory for all new concrete construction in sub-zero climates. But they fundamentally underestimated the vicious, predatory speed of the global energy conglomerates, because while the Swedish engineers were writing their open source patents, the industry was already drafting the regulatory chokehold that would bury their discovery under miles of bureaucratic red tape. To understand why this is a systemic threat, you have to look closer, much closer. We need to zoom in past the concrete slab, past the structural rebar, down to the microscopic architecture of the chemical lattice itself. Stay with me here, because this is where the physics become undeniable, and where the true danger to the fossil fuel industry begins. Standard residential heating relies on sensible heat. You burn a fuel, it heats the air cools down, and you burn more fuel. It is primitive, it is wildly inefficient. It guarantees you will continuously lose thermal bleed and continuously pay to replace it, but the Swedish engineers were exploiting latent thermochemical storage. This is a fundamentally different universe of thermodynamics. When you mix potassium carbonate with a highly specific catalyst known as gamma phase iron 3 oxide, you do not just get a salty powder. You forge a highly reactive, subatomic kinetic cage. Think of it as billions of microscopic steel mousetraps embedded evenly throughout your entire concrete foundation, all set and waiting. During the blistering heat of a summer afternoon, the high ambient temperature and natural humidity slowly seep into the invisible micropores of the concrete. This passive environmental heat exerts massive pressure on the chemical bonds inside the salt, forcing the cages to stretch open. The water molecules from the summer humidity are violently dragged inside the crystalline structure. The ambient heat is mathematically converted into pure chemical potential energy. It is locked, trapped in the dark. It just waits. Then, November arrives. The ambient room temperature slowly drops below the precise stoichiometric threshold of 68.4 degrees Fahrenheit. The chemical equilibrium of the concrete shatters. The iron-doped cages violently snap shut. And as they collapse, they brutally eject the trapped water molecules. Listen closely to the mechanics of this. As the H2O molecule is forced out of the crystalline structure, it physically scrapes against the gamma iron oxide walls. It generates shear kinetic friction on a subatomic scale. Now, multiply that microscopic friction by 84 trillion individual pores embedded inside a single cubic foot of foundation concrete. The result is a relentless, aggressive, silent wave of radiant heat. The enthalpy of the reaction yields an astonishing energy output, sustaining a localized surface temperature of 89 degrees Fahrenheit for months. No pilot light, no compressor, no toxic refrigerants. But here is the absolute genius of the iron catalyst. If you just used raw potassium salt, the aggressive expansion and contraction would shatter the concrete from the inside out within 3 winters. The foundation would literally turn to dust under the immense molecular stress. The gamma phase, iron 3 oxide, acts as a flexible. It allows the salt to cycle through hydration and dehydration thousands of times with absolutely zero structural degradation. Flawless thermal generation, year after year, for the entire lifespan of the house. Think about what that actually means for your utility bill. A standard forced air natural gas furnace consumes roughly 36,000 British thermal units per hour. It aggressively burns fossil fuels to blast scorched, dry air into a room, 71.3% of which instantly bleeds out through standard drywall and double-pane windows. The iron salt matrix requires 0 British thermal units of combustion. It outputs a continuous passive thermal blanket equal to 12,000 watts of pure electric resistance heating entirely for free. It operates on the exact opposite logic of the modern utility grid. The grid demands that you burn a finite, expensive resource over and over again to temporarily warm the empty air in your living room. The iron salt matrix does not heat the air. It fundamentally alters the thermal mass of the earth beneath you. It turns your foundation into an impenetrable thermal fortress. If the concrete itself is generating radiant energy, your walls stop bleeding heat. The thermal replacement rate drops to near 0. You stop buying propane. You stop renting natural gas. You step completely outside the recurring revenue model. And that level of complete, sovereign energy independence is a mathematical impossibility that the utility monopolies simply could not allow to exist in the open market. By the winter of 1985, the translated KTH technical papers had quietly crossed the Atlantic. The exact ratios of potassium carbonate and gamma phase iron 3 oxide were circulating through independent architectural firms in Boston, Chicago, and Minneapolis. Small-scale prototype homes were being poured. The data coming back was terrifyingly consistent. The heating bills of these homes were dropping by over 90%. And in the corporate boardrooms of the largest heating oil and natural gas conglomerates in North America, alarm bells began to deafen the executives. You have to understand that these executives are not comic book villains. They are rational, highly educated, aggressively pragmatic mathematicians with a strict fiduciary duty to their shareholders. They looked at the Swedish thermal data and immediately ran the economic projections. The residential heating industry relies entirely on a metric called the seasonal consumption volume. If an average household in a cold climate burns 640 gallons of propane every winter, the supply chains, the delivery fleets, the pipeline pressures, and the quarterly dividends are all calibrated to that exact volume. If a $22 concrete additive abruptly drops that consumption to 50 gallons per winter, the entire industry collapses. It is not a dip in profits. It is a catastrophic systemic implosion of a $184 billion infrastructure. The debt structures holding up the regional pipelines would default within 18 months. They could not let the iron salt matrix reach mass commercial adoption. But in a free market, you cannot simply ban a naturally occurring salt because it threatens your business model. You have to be surgical. You have to be invisible. They did not attack the chemical, they attacked the concrete. In 1986, a highly coordinated, heavily funded lobbying effort swept through the International Conference of Building Officials. This is the obscure, unelected regulatory body that authors the Uniform Building Code, the exact set of rules that dictates every single piece of material legally allowed to be used in residential construction. The energy lobbyists presented heavily skewed, highly technical metallurgical papers warning of the hypothetical dangers of using reactive chemical admixtures in load-bearing residential slabs. They argued, with incredible manufactured precision, that the rapid kinetic expansion of potassium cages could theoretically induce microfracturing in the concrete over a 50-year timeline. It was a complete distortion of the Swedish data. The gamma phase iron oxide specifically prevented that exact degradation. The KTH engineers had definitively proven it. But the truth did not matter. The lobbyists only needed to plant a microscopic seed of doubt regarding structural integrity. By 1988, the building codes were quietly, permanently altered. Section 403.2 of the Residential Structural Code was amended to explicitly cap the maximum allowable volume of reactive crystalline admixtures in load-bearing residential foundations at 0.05% by volume. The Swedish thermal battery required a minimum of 4.2% to achieve the vital endothermic reaction. It was brilliant. It was legal. It was devastating. With one stroke of a regulatory pen in a closed-door committee meeting, the ultimate weapon against the utility grid was rendered totally illegal to use in any new home construction. If an architect tried to include the exact iron-salt ratio in their blueprints, the municipal city planner would immediately reject the permits. If a rogue contractor tried to pour the mixture anyway, the home would fail its final structural inspection. The bank would instantly pull the mortgage. The insurance company would permanently revoke the homeowner policy. They built an invisible, impenetrable bureaucratic wall around the technology. The utility companies secured their recurring revenue. The natural gas meters kept spinning, the propane delivery trucks kept rolling, and the population kept paying an exorbitant, artificially enforced ransom just to keep from freezing in the dark. Total victory, silent execution, done. But the suppression did not stop with the residential building codes. They knew that as long as the raw industrial-grade chemical components were still available on the open market, someone, somewhere, would eventually try to retrofit the technology into existing basements. They had to cut the supply chain at its absolute root. The Building Code Amendments of 1988 were a masterpiece of regulatory capture, but the energy cartels knew it was not a flawless victory. The raw materials were still sitting on the open market. Anyone with a wheelbarrow, a cement mixer, and the translated Swedish technical papers could still buy Type 4 anhydrous potassium carbonate from a local masonry supplier and quietly mix it into their basement floor. The loophole was gaping. To guarantee absolute compliance, the cartel had to execute a hostile takeover of the supply chain itself. They had to ghost the chemical. Stay with me here, because the logistics of how you make a highly abundant earth mineral disappear from the consumer market without triggering an antitrust lawsuit is a masterclass in corporate warfare. You do not ban the compound. Banning it draws attention. Instead, you change its industrial classification. In 1991, a consortium of synthetic fertilizer giants and petrochemical lobbies filed a heavily obscured 300-page petition with occupational safety regulators. They successfully argued that the ultrafine sub-micron grade of gamma-phase iron-3 oxide, which is the exact irreplaceable catalyst required to make the thermal battery work safely, posed a severe inhalation hazard to untrained residential consumers. It was a fabricated crisis. The compound is significantly heavier than air. It does not aerosolize without industrial pressure. It is completely structurally harmless the moment it touches wet cement. But the petition was approved. Within 72 hours, the consumer supply lines vanished, gone. The classification of the iron catalyst and the vital Type 4 potassium carbonate was officially shifted to restricted commercial heavy industry use only. You could no longer walk into a supply yard and buy a 50-pound bag for $22. You now required a Level 3 commercial purchasing license, a verified industrial tax identification number, and a registered hazardous materials transport manifest just to look at the inventory. Let us look at the raw, mathematical devastation of this maneuver. In 1990, the North American consumer market purchased approximately 2.4 million metric tons of this specific commercial-grade salt compound, mostly for advanced masonry and agricultural buffering. By 1993, consumer availability had plummeted to a heavily restricted 412,000 metric tons. The supply was completely choked. To keep the chemical manufacturers from revolting, the energy cartel essentially subsidized the loss. The fractional profit margins of the chemical suppliers were artificially inflated by a 0.84% margin shift on their heavy industry contracts, effectively bribing them to comply with the consumer blackout. They made significantly more money selling less volume to a smaller, elite circle of corporate buyers. The residential consumer was completely locked out. If a rogue contractor tried to source the raw materials to build a decentralized thermal battery, they would be immediately flagged by the supply chain software. If they tried to import it from Europe, it would be seized at the port under the new commercial restriction codes. The energy cartel had successfully taken a naturally occurring, deeply abundant mineral combination and trapped it behind an impenetrable wall of commercial licensing and industrial red tape. The permanent solution to the global residential heating crisis was now sitting in massive concrete silos across the industrial Midwest, legally inaccessible to the exact people freezing in their homes. The monopoly on your winter survival was completely, mathematically secure. The natural gas lines pumped. The electric meters spun. The system worked exactly as it was engineered to. But monopolies are inherently arrogant. They assume that regulatory walls and supply chain ghosting are invincible. They assume that if you crush a technology in the 1980s, it stays buried in the dark forever. They did not account for the digital age. And they certainly did not account for the quiet, underground network of structural engineers who kept those original 1973 Swedish blueprints hidden in their desk drawers for over 3 decades, waiting for the exact right moment to break the blockade. The executives in the boardroom made a fatal miscalculation. They believed they could erase a thermodynamic reality by simply choking the supply chain and manipulating the building codes. They assumed the 1973 Stockholm directives were lost to history, rotting in a forgotten filing cabinet. But monopolies are built on the arrogant assumption that they can control the flow of information forever. They could not. In the winter of 2019, a highly encrypted, decentralized server hosted out of Reykjavik quietly published a raw, digitized, unredacted copy of the original Swedish KTH engineering documents. The exact stoichiometric ratios, the precise hydration coefficients, the molecular blueprints for the ultimate solid-state thermal battery were suddenly and permanently immortalized on the open internet. And a quiet underground coalition of off-grid architects and rogue structural engineers did not just read the papers, they immediately began weaponizing the loopholes. Remember Section 403.2 of the Uniform Building Code? The precise regulatory amendment the energy lobbyists authored to ban reactive admixtures in load-bearing residential foundations? The rogue engineers realized the cartel made a massive, fatal semantic error. The legal code explicitly and exclusively applied to load-bearing concrete, the structural weight of the house. The law said absolutely nothing about a floating interior subfloor. To bypass the commercial ghosting of the raw chemicals, this decentralized collective realized you do not need a Level 3 industrial purchasing license if you simply know how to read agricultural tax classifications. Agricultural-grade potassium carbonate is legally classified as a non-hazardous, unrestricted soil buffer. You can legally purchase it by the metric ton for literal pennies on the dollar. And the heavily restricted gamma phase iron 3 oxide, the irreplaceable catalyst the cartel completely erased from the consumer market, you synthesize it yourself. By taking standard ferrous sulfate, an incredibly cheap, widely available garden fertilizer, and running it through a basic, low-heat calcination process at exactly 412 degrees Fahrenheit, the molecular structure transmutates. You manually forge the exact iron catalyst in a standard garage. The cartel tried to lock the door, but they left the raw materials sitting in the dirt. Across the freezing, sub-zero climates of North America and Northern Europe, an invisible architectural rebellion is currently taking place. Independent contractors and sovereign homeowners are pouring 2-inch thick, non-structural thermal floating slabs directly over their existing, inefficient basement floors. They are mixing the exact 14.6 pounds of the chemical cocktail per cubic yard of wet cement. They are building the subatomic cages. They are locking in the summer heat. They are decoupling entirely from the grid. The mechanics of their rebellion are perfectly silent. The winter arrives, the ambient room temperature drops below 68 degrees, the iron cages violently snap shut, the localized molecular friction begins. The concrete begins to radiantly, endlessly push the freezing temperatures back into the earth. The utility company sends the January heating bill. The meter reads 0. The propane delivery truck drives straight past the house. Total independence. 1 pour. Done. Next time you walk down into your basement and feel that bitter, freezing chill creeping up through the soles of your shoes, I want you to stop and understand exactly what you are feeling. You are not feeling the natural, unavoidable temperature of the earth. You are feeling the deliberate, mathematically engineered failure of your own home. You are standing on a missed opportunity. You are standing inside a recurring revenue model designed specifically to drain your wealth every single winter for the rest of your life. But somewhere, right now, someone is pouring a wet mixture of iron and salt. The molecular cages are opening, the heat is locking in, and the $184 billion grid is slowly, quietly becoming entirely obsolete.